experts in the field of politics, economics, and science. Following the updates, we will have a question and answer period where you'll be able to ask questions via the chat function. Please send your questions in the chat directly to me, Nathan Diesenhaus, as I will be moderating this Q&A period. I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Providing us a political update, David Weinberg, an economics update from Professor Leonardo Lederman, and an update from our science field Professor Mordechai Gerlich. David Weinberg is a founding vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a leading security think tank and a diplomatic and defense columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom newspapers. Concurrently, he directs the Israel office of the Canadian Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA. He has represented the Canadian Jewish community in promoting Canada-Israel relations for 35 years, beginning in 1985 when he became the Director of Research and Education for the Canadian Israel Committee. Professor Leonardo Lederman is a professor at the Jack and Lisa Yael Professor Emeritus of Comparative Economics, the Berglas School of Economics, and visiting professor at the Koller School of Management at Tel Aviv University. He is also the Chief Economic Advisor at Bank Hapoalim. And finally, Professor Mordechai Gerlich is an Associate Professor in Tel Aviv University's Department of Clinical Microbiology and Immunology. His research observes the immune system's response to cell death, focusing on the role of necroptosis and protopsis in inflammation. Professor Gerlich seeks to understand how pathogens, viruses and bacteria, are recognized within the human immune system, and therefore how various inflammatory responses occur. As a matter of housekeeping, each speaker will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer period. I would like everyone on the call to know that Professor Lederman needs to leave about 10 minutes to the hour for a call with the Chief Economic Advisors with other banks. And Professor Gerlich will need to leave for a TV interview about his research. Therefore, I would like to hand over the mic to David Weinberg.
Good afternoon.
Okay. We're having a video.
Can you hear and see me fine?
Yes.
Okay. After 550 days of political deadlock, that's more than a year and a half and 3 heated election campaigns, Israel has a new government, as I'm sure you all know. It declares itself to be a national unity government. It calls itself an emergency government meant to tackle the coronavirus crisis and the ensuing economic difficulties. I'm sure we'll hear more about this later on from Professor Lederman, but Israel is suffering 27% unemployment. That's over 1 million Israelis out of work, and entire sectors of the economy have been hit hard. But Israel's new coalition government is not an ideal construct. It's actually a bifurcated government where 2 legally embedded blocks, the Likud bloc and the blue and white bloc, can check each other in every possible way, every step of the way. Each side has sweeping powers to stymie one another. Essentially, the coalition deal reflects deep distrust between the 2 rival blocs, and both sides are neutered except where they may be, hopefully, agree on overarching policies such as health and economic recovery master plans. Under normal circumstances, I would say that this is an impossible way to govern the country. But these are not normal times. Israel could not afford a 4th consecutive election amidst the coronavirus crisis, and Israel's most critical challenges, including confronting Iran, can best be tackled with a broad government. In his address 2 days ago to the Knesset after presenting the new government, Netanyahu set out 5 priorities. First, dealing with the coronavirus crisis and especially preparing for a possible second round in the fall or winter. Passing an economic recovery budget, which inevitably will be an austerity budget within 120 days. Third, preparing for further confrontation with Iran, which requires a military buildup, and that, of course, contradicts the two previous priority items because it's going to cost a lot of money. Fourth, dealing with legal challenges to Israel's very legitimacy stemming from the International Criminal Court. And last but not least, advancing the Trump peace plan, including implementation of Israeli sovereignty moves over settlements and strategic territories in the West Bank. Now, this five-part agenda would be challenging in the best of times. It will be extra difficult in a government situation where its constituent parts may be pulling in different directions. It could be complicated further still if conflict develops between the Trump administration and Iran, or between Israel and Iranian proxies. It will definitely be complicated if Israel proceeds with a sovereignty declaration, and I'll come back to that matter in just a moment. I'm going to leave some of the comments I was going to make on the economic situation to Professor Lederman, who's obviously much more qualified to comment than I am. I'll just make one personal comment that Israeli government assistance to small businesses and the unemployed has been, in my view, much too slow to arrive, even though the government has set aside 80 billion shekels for this purpose, which for Israel is an enormous sum of money. As for applying Israeli sovereignty to settlements in Judea and Samaria and to the Jordan Valley, the government is going to need to move very cautiously. If the government insists on proceedings, it's going to need to do so delicately and reach out earnestly to the Democrats in the United States and liberal political forces in other countries, including Canada. It will need to explain that it views its moves as part of the Trump Mideast peace plan, which it views as the only realistic path towards a two-state solution, and that Israel is committed to the entirety of the Trump plan. And that means leaving a horizon open for a Palestinian state in the West Bank, if or when the Palestinians become truly peaceful, or as U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Freeman commented last week, when the Palestinians become Canadians. It also means committing to a 4-year building freeze in lands where Israeli law will not apply, as per Trump's vision for peace, and that's about 50% of what the Oslo Accords called Area C. I want to add one final comment before leaving lots of time for questions and answers. One additional consideration, a perspective that goes beyond the hardcore issues that we just discussed. In my view, it's equally important, and it's urgently needed to tone down this country's political heat, to restrain Israel's raging political fevers after 18 months of furious campaigning. Israel needs 2 or 3 or 4 years of relative quiet and recuperation. We need fetters on our political passions. And this is true regarding many issues, regarding the fierce debates over Netanyahu's criminality, an issue that should and now will be settled, decided by the courts. It's true regarding the ugly campaigns of anti-religious hate that were run by some politicians in recent campaigns, as well as concerns over religious coercion and the draft of the ultra-Orthodox. It's true regarding debate over the powers of the Supreme Court about conversion policy and many, many other issues. Compromise may not be possible in all these spheres, but at least the new government can lower the flames. Indeed, bringing about a climate of relative calm could be the greatest contribution that the Netanyahu-Gantz government makes. National unity, however temporary and fragile, is necessary and worthwhile. Perhaps our politicians will learn to cooperate a bit, putting broad national interests ahead of their narrow partisan goals. Certainly, the vast majority of Israelis expect them to do so. I'll end there. and we can continue the conversation following the next two briefings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. I'd like to pass the mic over to Professor Liederman.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this call. Thanks to the Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University. We truly appreciate all the effort done in Canada and the togetherness of the dialogue and the continuous relationship with all of you. Let me, as indicated, I'm an economist at the School of Economics and the Business School of Tel Aviv University, and I'm also the Chief Economic Advisor of Bank Hapoalim, the largest commercial bank in Israel. And I think to start, I would like to make the point that in terms of the rate of infection and contagion, in terms of the incidence, the medical numbers for Israel, and Professor Gerlitz, of course, will be discussing further these issues. The numbers for Israel are quite remarkable. We have a population of 9 million people, and as of today, we have 277 victims, deaths accumulated over all this period. Not only this, but out of the 277 people, the incidence has been very, very selective. If you take into account the ultra-Orthodox areas of Bnei Brak, some areas in Jerusalem, other places, and some quite elderly people, age even 80 and above, with medical preconditions, you can see that indeed these numbers are quite remarkable. I was looking at Canada. Canada has a population of 38 million people, and you have accumulated up until now 5,800 victims or death cases. If we calculate these deaths per million, in the case of Israel, we have about 31 deaths per million. We have 9 million people, so 9 times 31 gives you the 277 we had before. Canada has 160 deaths per million. It is a very good number. Sorry, of course, every death is a tragedy, of course. But if you compare that with the countries like the US, where it is close to double the number, not to mention Belgium, where the number is close to 800 people death per million, these are, of course, numbers to take into account. Of course, one has to be very careful with international comparisons. Israel has mainly one point of entry, the Ben Gurion Airport, and other countries have many, many points of entry, including Belgium, including Canada. So, on a demographic point of view, the composition of the population in Israel is much younger than in some of the other countries. And so we have to take into account all these things here. On the economics or the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, of course, Israel is in a situation of recession like Canada, like the US, like almost the whole world. Recession is a time in which there is a contraction in the level of output, where the growth rate is negative, where the rate of unemployment is going up. But this is a completely different recession than those that we know from the past. Because in this recession, everything begins with the lockdown, with the fact that people are told not to go to work, are required not to go to work, and companies are required not to accept their employees back to work and to stop some of their production, not to mention areas like tourism, air traffic, and so on and so forth. And so about 80 to 85% of the unemployment in Israel right now are people that are on leave from their work. And it is true that nobody knows, no single person, economist, or any other person knows what percent of the people that have been requested and required to be on leave are going to be back to work. This is a very important parameter about which we have very little evidence so far. But in terms of the recession, we are talking about something very similar to what is expected in the case of the US. For this year, a drop in GDP, gross domestic product, of about between 5 and 6%. And the main negative impact on areas like, as I indicated before, tourism, the whole hotels industry, air travel, and you know, all the cultural events and so on and so forth. Some of the trade and shopping centers have been closed, but here we come to the third point, which is that in terms of the exit, in terms of the reopening of the economy and of our lives, Israel has made a very substantial progress. And you know, this week, all the schools are going back to normal. It is planned that next week, restaurants and coffee shops will be open. And we can, you know, move around in outside, of course, with a mask, but we can move around quite freely. Of course, there are new measures, and we have to be careful because there could be a second wave and other waves that could be a source of trouble. But if someone had told me 2 months ago or a month and a half ago that Israel will be where it is right now, as of May 19, I would not have believed that. And here I must tell you that in our democratic society, there has been a lot of pressure by the public, by the people. And so what began as a sort of a dictum by the Ministry of Health and by the government, with the passage of time, there were some areas and there were some sectors and there were some segments of the population that began being very vocal and requiring that we should move on to sort of eliminate, at least gradually, some of the lockdown requirements, especially given that it is now recognized by everybody that the incidence of COVID-19 in Israel has been extremely selective. You can point the areas, the exact areas in the neighborhoods of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem where the incidence has been high, and you can point the areas where there has been, you know, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say there has been no need whatsoever for having the lockdown. Of course, people from the Ministry of Health will tell me that, look, the good numbers are the result of the severe measures, and they may have a point there. Let me conclude this first round with a comment, a final comment on this specific issue. You know, as economists and people also in the social sciences, we felt from the beginning the tension, the quite natural tension between the medical view and the economic, social, sociological view of this issue. Of course, to be 100% sure about the health situation, you can put everybody on lockdown for 3 months or something like this. But it is clear to everybody that this is not sustainable. And it is clear to everybody that the economic and social costs of doing this will be enormous. And it is, I'm quite happy to report that in Israel, the debate about this issue, about this tension, has been quite open. And again, it took about two to 3 weeks, but already in the 3rd week of the lockdown, there started a real discussion about this issue, about when, if and when we should start sort of what they can be called as the exit strategy from this issue. And as it was indicated by the previous speaker, one of the most vocal groups has been the small and medium enterprises, small and medium sort of offices run professionals running their offices. And I must say that not only Israel, the United States, and many other countries were not really prepared to provide a sort of a safety net to this sector that even we as economists have not really paid enough attention in the textbooks and in our classes, the small and medium enterprises. So true, it took some time, but it is now happening that there is support there. And I think the current expectation is that the release from the lockdowns will continue, and that hopefully the economy will start recovering after what appears to be everywhere and also in Israel, quite a dismal second quarter of the year, namely April, May, June. The numbers, the economic numbers are going to be awful because they reflect something that was accumulated through the lockdowns. But the hope is that things will begin to normalize sometime in the second half of the year. And of course, we will not go back to the same level of production and employment with which we started the year in January 2020. Let me stop here, and I'm with you for the Q&A and to listen to the third speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Liederman. I'm sure it's going to lead to some interesting questions on the economic front. Now I'd like to pass the mic on to Professor Gerlich.
Hi, everybody. So first of all, can you open my sharing screen? I see it's still off. Can you? Okay. Oh, here we go. So hi, everybody, and thank you for inviting me and having me here. First time I'm talking with the Canadian friends of TAU, and we will probably switch gears. Okay, let me actually. Oh, let me see. Can I? Do you see my presentation, or you see the other? Let's see.
You had it right before. Now we can't really see it.
Now you don't see it. Okay, so I will. So sorry that I'm not looking into the screen. Okay, I will. I just have two screens and one with the camera. So I will just put the presentation. Now you see it. Here we go.
Perfect.
Okay. So I'm looking aside. Okay, let's try to move a little. Here we go. So I can try to look at you. So a little switch gear. I'm not economics. I'm an immunologist. Although I have my ideas on the economic and probably some mistakes that we're doing that are hurting us. But I will tell you about what we are doing in Tel Aviv University from the medical point. And what we did, the big effort of Tel Aviv University, the medical school, as well as the life science, was to help all the hospitals and the laboratories at the beginning, where we didn't know where actually it's going. And there was a big need for testing for the coronavirus. So one of the first things that the university did, we basically volunteer, or our students, which are very talented, volunteer into all the hospitals so they can provide more hands at work, helping doing all the tests that were actually done in the hospitals at the beginning. At the same time, because the hospitals are limited in their capacity, we went in the university and set up basically two systems. One system is we built a full genomic, I will call laboratories, which basically test for the genomic of the virus, so we can see if people are infected. And that was really important at the beginning of the pandemic. And at the same time, we started to think what is actually missing, and really what we can give to the government, to the people that make decisions, which tools are actually missing so we can get out of the lockdown. And really one of the key essay or thing that is missing is our ability to say how many people were actually been in contact with the virus and how many probably developed immunity to the virus. And this is something that, of course, the people that need to decide if they can open the lockdown, they need to understand what is going on in the society and not just look on the people in the hospital. And for that, what we did is we set up in two months ago, really, I would say my lab together with Professor Munitz. He was just on the background, but he needed to go to do more testing now. We set up basically a journey that we said we need to set up a serological test, which is basically the only test that can confirm that you actually saw the virus. Because we basically, what we do, we can measure the antibody that your immune system develop, and then they are staying for a long period, so we can look on someone, and by testing a blood sample, we can say, did he already saw the virus, and did he have a potential of immunity? And so the reason they are important is, again, I think one of the key things that, although I'm not economist, is really restoring the economy, because we need to understand that there is no health with no economy. If there is no money, hospitals cannot run and people will die from regular infections. So the economy is big part of the health as a whole. And the second is, as this is a new virus, we need to understand how the virus is spreading. And this is a very important tool for understanding the epidemiology of the virus. Therapeutic, this is again a very important tool when we set up in the future. We can, some of the, I would say, therapeutic out there right now is to give plasma which contain antibody from donors, and you can give it to people that in critical condition, and you actually want to be able to see if the plasma or serum from the donors actually contain the antibody. So this is again a very important tool. And the last one, when we talk about vaccination in the future, the way to test if the vaccine works is to actually test for serological assay. So this is also important in the near future when vaccine will be developed. So that was our goal, or what we set up. And we basically had the 4 objectives. We wanted to have an assay that is very sensitive and very specific. And I will get into this in a minute. So it means that we will not have false positive. We will not claim that someone saw the virus by mistake, okay? And on the other hand, we want to be able to catch everybody that already saw the virus. The second one, we wanted to be quick. And this is important because if you have an assay that is taking a full day, then the ability of every laboratory to do hundreds of tests, as maybe in Israel we don't need, but definitely in US and Canada, this is something that is needed because the pandemic is much bigger. We want assay to be quick. It should be simple, again, from reasons that laboratories don't like to have something very complex. And we set up a goal because it's important for laboratories to take our assay, to go very quickly into the FDA, into this emergency usage authorization, and to basically have all their regulation prepared already when we set up the assay. And the assay that we set up, it's a very quick assay. Basically, we can sample the blood, and we separate the blood. You can see the yellow color here. This is the plasma. So you separate the cells from the liquid, basically. And in this liquid, we have antibodies. So we take this liquid, we basically put it into this kind of a well plate. So you can see that in this well plate, we can do 100 samples of patients. And we need to wait 30 minutes. After that, we need to wash. Another 20 minutes of incubation with antibodies that can detect the antibody that are in our sample, and then we go wash it and read it on a special reader. Now, what we set up was an assay that is, so usually this kind of serological tests take usually around 4 to 5 hours to operate. And we were able with our technology that we decided to use to cut down this assay to be 60 minutes. So you can do one plate in 60 minutes, and actually I will say one lab that one person can do 500 in 1 hour. That's kind of the amount that we can do without even automation. I will say that one of the tricks that we use is this electrochemiluminescence, and this I can answer a question later, or you can Google it. This is actually what gives us a very high sensitivity and specificity. This is kind of I would say technique or that is less used, and it's not fully recognized, but it's giving us many advantage on the regular, I will say, serological tests. And in few slides, just to show you what we were able already to achieve in these 2 months. So I will say we are already testing hospital in Israel. Like every day I'm testing here few hundreds of hospital samples. We already set up into the community, starting with the military. So we focus on the military units so we can clear them, so they can operate with no fear that someone is infected. What you can see here is basically results of positive from patients from the hospital and negative people which didn't saw the virus. And when we can look on different antibodies, so we have different types. There is IgG, IgM, and what you can see here that we basically, the specificity is really high, 98%, because you see that we don't really get any people that is not sick as a positive one. But you can see here that we are still missing some patients. So what we decided to do is to take it to the next level, and this is a little, I would say, bioinformatic, but what we can do is now we can combine. So we can ask if this patient that was here negative, is it really negative on the other antibody, or maybe it's in the positive area? And the quick answer is that when we combine the antibodies together, and we don't really need to go into all the details, the idea is that by this combination, now we can basically, this is the negative. So if we define that someone is positive now by having at least 2 antibodies, we can stay very high in our specificity. But more importantly, if you remember that we were missing many, using this method now, we go up to 92% in our sensitivity. Now I want to mention that this 92%, this is when we take all patients. And you can see that I can basically have them grade by days post-symptoms. And this is important because antibody accumulate in time. So it's definitely harder to find the antibody in the first week. But even in the first week, which I will say most of the tested that were approved for FDA cannot catch these persons, we are already standing in 70%, which is very, very high for sensitivity at this stage. So I will basically summarize, go back into our objective. So we were able to achieve a method that has a very high sensitivity and specificity. So 2 weeks after infection, we are clearly on the 98% in both, which is very, very high. It's a very quick assay. So it's, like I said, 1 hour. And we are now setting the automation for this. So it will be a full automated. So you can just put the sample and leave it and come after 1 hour and get your results, which make it, of course, very simple. And regarding the FDA, I will say I'm waiting every day for their letter, as we already sent them all the details something like 14 days ago. So this is usually kind of the time they need to come back to us and say if we are missing something, and hopefully we will get the approval. So with that, I finish my slides. So let me first stop the sharing. And I will say, as it was mentioned in the beginning, I need to move to a TV studio, okay? But I will open anyway my cell phone. So I will log in through my cell phone. So for the question and answer, I will listen and be able to answer your question from my phone, okay?
Okay, thank you, Professor Gerlich. I would now like to open up the floor for any questions that you have. Please indicate which speaker you'd like to address if possible, and please send your questions directly to me in the chat. I was going to actually start with a question that we had for Professor Gerlich, but I'll let you.
Okay, no. So ask while I'm here.
Okay. Okay, so here's a question someone sent in that although we're still in much of the world is still in the first wave, everyone's worried about a second wave. What do you think the next 6 months will look like?
So very quickly, the real answer, we don't know. We need to understand. Sometimes it's really hard in life to say we don't know. So we don't know. But I will say I'm optimistic. So I will take it into two sides. So countries like the East, let's say the East Coast, for example, I will say that the chances that they will get a second big wave is very, very minor. So there is always, if you had a big spread and you didn't do a lockdown, you're probably less worried about the second wave. While if I take Israel, for example, I will not be scared about second wave in the coming months because we already suffer from 45 degrees Celsius, and it's not really good for the virus. But definitely in the coming winter, because Israel basically did a very good lockdown, from the purpose of lockdown, I have my concern about the economy, but the problem will be in winter because flight will continue, and then people from the state that maybe have the virus but they are asymptomatic will bring it into Israel. And basically in Israel, people didn't see the virus. So there definitely will be a second wave. How big it is, that's still a big question. How much immunity we already have. And there are some signs that we actually have sort of immunity even without seeing this virus, because we see his cousins, I will say, the other human coronavirus that doesn't do a very bad disease, they actually give us protection.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, good luck on your interview. And if you can hook in by phone, that would be great. This question is for Professor Liederman. If, as you expect, tourism will suffer, how can Israel look to make up that loss? Is there another sector that is all ready to come to the forefront?
Well, I think, clearly Israel depends on tourism, but, the greatest bulk of the Israeli economy has to do with services, like in advanced economies like Canada and the United States. I think, it's going to be very difficult to offset the negative impact of the lack of incoming tourists. Think of the impact on, on trade, on all kind of hotels, restaurants, shops, taxis, and so on and so forth. Israel is very similar to other countries. I think the food industry has been doing well, and of course, there has been no debate that food producer companies need to continue producing, because this is like a national emergency. The construction sector has continued its production, its activity. Lots of the construction is done in the outside, of course, and I understand that even in the worst days of the lockdown, we had about 50–60% of the activity in the sector going on. But overall, of course, there is going to be a decrease in the overall level of activity. There is a lot of talk about the high-tech sector, including biotech, including the pharmaceutical. And as you know, there are many efforts to develop a vaccine and medication here in Israel. Of course, when I talk to people in the high-tech sector, what they tell me is that, yes, there are new opportunities created by this crisis. On the other hand, there are many investors that are quite dubious about putting the money on the table, even if they were quite convinced that they were going to do that, especially if we are talking about startups. And the idea here is that, of course, this crisis has taught us once again the importance of liquidity. The importance of liquidity, cash is king, and so I think some investors may want to wait a little bit to see if and when they can sort of commit some of their funds to a period that, as you know, in the case of startups and some of these investments, it requires a period of illiquidity for, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I'm talking about venture capital, private equity, and so on and so forth. So from that point of view, yes, there is a lot of activity in the thinking, in trying to design new products and new technologies. On the other hand, one will require a little bit of a more quiet general environment in order for the investors to be more relaxed about investing those amounts.
Okay, thank you very much. Here is a two-pronged question for David Weinberg. David, one of our participants asked, do you think that Bibi will actually transfer the prime ministership to Gantz in 18 months? And how do you think the Trump plan impacted the elections in Israel?
Okay, thank you for those two questions. I'm not going to give a straight answer to the first question. Will the rotation from Netanyahu to Gantz take place in November 2021? That requires levels of prophecy that I don't have and that the Jewish people have not been endowed with since the destruction of the Second Temple, according to the Talmud. So it's pushing it. I actually believe that Netanyahu is seeking to become the next president of Israel next fall. When Ruby Rivlin's term as president ends, the president is elected by the Knesset, not by the public. And there are many members of the Knesset on both sides of the aisle who will be happy to move Netanyahu on and up to out of the prime minister's office and out of day-to-day politics into the president's post. Netanyahu, of course, might be interested in that because the president is immune from prosecution for any and all misdemeanors or crimes. Under the Israeli Constitution, the president cannot be hauled before a court for anything, and that would be one way of Netanyahu pushing off his legal troubles for many years more. But I don't know whether the rotation will take place. Obviously, Netanyahu is the more experienced of the two politicians. Benny Gantz, according to all accounts, is a honorable and brave Israeli, but he's new to politics. He's never held an executive position, never been a minister, never mind alternate prime minister or prime minister. So a lot of things can happen over the next year and a half. As for the Trump plan and the Israeli elections, the short answer is no. I don't think that the Trump plan had a significant impact on the outcome of the recent Israeli election. For one simple reason. We had more or less the exact same election results this March as we did last September, as we did last April. 3 elections in a row, including 2 previous elections where the Trump plan had not yet been on the table. Despite the indictments against Netanyahu and despite the Trump plan, the election result really hasn't changed much in a year and a half, which is why we went to a near deadlock in each of the 3 recent elections, and only this new pairing between blue and white and Netanyahu allowed Israel to cobble together a government. Otherwise, we would have been deadlocked, and we were very close to going to a 4th election in August or September.
Thank you. That's a lot to digest. So I understand Mati is back, excuse me, online. And there was a question here. Can the test you were talking about be used in airports to quickly re-enable air travel?
Oh, okay. Wait, let me, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, you're coming loud and clear.
Okay. So the airport, the clearance in airport, I will say that this is a very hard test to do. So most of the tests that are trying to develop serological tests that will give you an answer in this 5 minutes, we tested a lot of them in Israel, and I will say they are very, very bad. What I mean by very bad is that they will miss by 40% positive people. So you can understand it's kind of really flipping a coin. It's not really a test that you can say. Now, tests like I did, it is something that you can put it in airport, definitely a big airport. But again, you will need to understand that now you will need to take a sample and say to the person, okay, you need to wait 1.5 hours now and run into the lab. Now, I'm not sure this is really worth the effort, to be honest. When I'm thinking about the virus and how, I will say, deadly it is, to be honest, and it's my opinion, you can probably find other immunologists that will disagree, I am not that concerned. I think we learned that it is attacking really the elderly people, of course, and again, it's bad, but we actually have kind of a fingerprint of who is, need to be alarmed from the virus, and it's not the majority of the population, and therefore it's not, I will say, as deadly as we were imagining in December. So taking this one into account, I am not sure that we need to have testing in airports unless you can have testing in really 1 to 2 minutes, and they should be very, very accurate. You don't want to have false positive or negative. So my answer for that is that we will learn to live with the virus, probably something like a flu. And when you really think about the flu, it's very similar. You need to remember that we have a vaccine for the flu. Therefore, the numbers are slightly better with the flu, but not really dramatic, I will say, even when you take into account number. I will just give one number to explain that. Italy is considered to be one of the worst places for the coronavirus, because in Italy, we will have something around 35,000 deaths. Now, just to take this one into account, 2 years ago, or 2017, was a very bad influenza in Italy. They had 27,000 deaths from influenza. So when you think about these numbers, they are not that different when you think about big numbers. And this is with the vaccination for flu. So in 1 year, we will probably have a vaccination. And therefore, we need to be very careful with people that are in risk. My father has a COPD. He's 70 years old. He's sitting at home, and I'm doing all the shopping. I'm not letting him to go out. But this is the minority of the people. We need to understand that. So I hope I kind of answer the question. And as I said, I'm very optimistic. Maybe that's my nature. I don't know.
Well, listen, it's always good to be optimistic, but you're the professional, the expert there. So I'll buy into it as well as hopefully all our other listeners. I have one more question. Time is of the essence, and this is actually was put forth towards all the speakers. Professor Liederman had to go, so we'll leave it to Moti and David to answer. And the question is, how much of a problem is it that death rates not accurately reported in many jurisdictions, or the number of infected being symptomatic or asymptomatic, not having up-to-date information, so making projections with fractions were neither the numerator or the denominator?
Professor Gerlich, you want to go first?
I can go from my side, and I think me, Professor Kimron, Professor Munitz, and we had also Professor Adi from the economics. We actually put a paper in January, I think, in the Yediot Achronot, exactly about this. This is the big concern. So all the decision that all the world took was a gut feeling. Nothing was really supported. And when we started to have the facts, it was too late because government went into, their kind of idea how to handle it, and that's it. It's very hard to change the policy. What I mean is that it was very scary at the beginning, but when you started to get the number from China, it wasn't that scary. We started to realize that it's not as bad. And I can tell you that, like I said, in Israel, I'm testing, like I said, the army, and I can test unit that you had someone sick in the unit, and the moment he started to cough and feel bad, he was put aside. Now, until now, I couldn't find even one soldier from the same unit that got infected. So that's actually telling us that the fact about this being very, very contagious is we need to take it also into account that it's probably true if you are sitting in the same office in very close contact. But if you have the 2 meter aside and even putting a mask on your face, you probably are very, very safe. And again, it's taking time. I like to joke that this probably was the first time that Trump got his gut feeling correctly, that it's not that bad. But that's not because he believes in science. So I think now that we have the tools, I hope that the government and the decision maker will use the tools to get to the right decision, which need to include economy, need to include everything on the table. There is a life, like I said, public health. Every dollar we can translate it into health. How many people are going to die because the economy is bad? And this is something that I think was totally ignored during the crisis. And we will pay the price, unfortunately, for that.
Thank you. David?
And I leave it to the economists now.
Okay.
2 quick comments. Number one, Israel's expenditure on health as a percentage of GDP is considerably lower than that of the United States and Canada and the OECD average. In Canada, it's about 10% of GDP. The OECD average is 9%. In the US, it's 19%. In Israel, it's barely 7.5%. Same thing if you look at health spending in a per capita way. The situation is even worse. Israel spends barely $2,700 per person on health, whereas in the US and Canada, it's $5,000 or $9,000 per capita. So as Professor Gerlich said, there's a major problem with funding of the Israeli health system. But I want to take the question briefly in a different direction, because I don't think that we can ignore China's criminal culpability for the deadly coronavirus outbreak. The case against China gets stronger by the day. It's increasingly clear that the Chinese Communist Party and the Politburo concealed, falsified, and fabricated information about the rampant spread of the disease in China for as much as 40 days before warning the rest of the world about the epidemic. They suppressed data. They used massive state surveillance to silence dissenters. Whistleblowers disappeared, and they purposely bamboozled the World Health Organization. In short, China cost the world many lives and enormous economic dislocation that may take years to overcome. So having a clear picture of the true numbers and regarding the spread of the virus is critical to preventing another outbreak. We still don't know what the real numbers are in Turkey, Iran, or Egypt. And for Israel, that's a concern because these countries could impact on our surroundings. So it's a big problem.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to thank all of you, David Weinberg, Professor Gerlich, and Professor Liederman, for being here with us today for the updates and the insights into what has been going on in Israel amidst COVID-19. For more information on what both organizations are doing to help the fight the coronavirus, please visit cftu.ca and jnf.ca. From JNF Canada and the Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University, I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you.